This video is now in session, and today we're going to take a look at the 2024 Senate elections. This will be a particularly tough Senate election cycle for the Democrats because of the amount of seats that they have to defend in this class of Senate seats. Here you can see that 34 seats will be up for re-election, including one special election seat in Nebraska. And so usually it's 33, but this year it's 34. And so if we look at the composition between how many seats Democrats have to defend, it's 20 versus the Republicans 13. Or actually for the Democrats, it should be 20, and then Republicans should be 14 this election cycle. But if we go even further, you'll see that Democrats have to defend seats in much more competitive states that Trump has won and states that Republicans have previously won statewide. That includes Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Montana, Nevada, and Arizona. Meanwhile, if you look at the competitive Senate seats for the Republicans, it's really just Texas and Florida, and that's with an asterisk as well, because if you look at Florida these past 8 years, it's been trending more conservative under Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. And even though Ted Cruz, who's the current incumbent senator of Texas, even though he underperforms compared to other statewide Republicans, it's not to the point where he can overturn Trump's 5.5 percentage point victory in the 2020 election. And so if you look at this election in 2018, this was a year that Democrats were truly galvanized, especially young Democrats in Texas who voted in record numbers for Beto O'Rourke. Since then, it's been more Republican on the Senate level as well as the governor level, where Beto O'Rourke ran in that election against the incumbent governor, Greg Abbott, and he lost handily, 10.9 percentage points. And so these states not really competitive this cycle. Now, if we look at some of these changes that will be made between 2018 and 2024, you'll see that in West Virginia, Joe Manchin is not running for re-election, and that's because Jim Justice, the opposition, is an incredibly popular governor of West Virginia. And so this race is guaranteed to go to the Republican Party. And then if you look at Maryland, in Maryland you have a popular governor running on the Republican side, Larry Hogan. And so even though we think that Democrats, because of the partisan nature of the state, will still win this election, they will have to spend more money than usual to uphold the seat, which means money diverted from these more competitive states. And so with these elections, you'll see that Democrats are already starting off at a disadvantage. But there is some good news for the Democrats. If we look at the Rust Belt states, they're going to be much more favorable for the Democrats on the Senate level compared to the presidential level. And that's because of two things: candidate incumbency, and as well as how the Republicans portray themselves in these states. If you look at Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, Tammy Baldwin is the current Democratic incumbent senator of the state. Meanwhile, Bob Casey Jr. is the incumbent senator of Pennsylvania. And that is important, really important, because Tammy Baldwin is well known in Wisconsin and well known for good. She is incredibly popular with her constituents, and that's why you see in this election cycle, Republicans aren't even trying that much to take over the seat. You can see here that the declared candidates, they don't have a Wikipedia page for themselves, they don't have any governing experience, and most of them don't really have any competitive campaigning experience that would allow them to attract attention to defeat such a powerful incumbent. And if you look at the money being raised here, on the Democratic side, Tammy Baldwin had raised $27 million since the 2018 election, which is a huge amount of money. And so Tammy Baldwin is generally a good candidate for the Democrats, and she'll be able to hold on her own, even if Kamala Harris has a competitive presidential election in the same state. It's even more true on the Pennsylvania side of things. Bob Casey Jr. Has name recognition going back decades, and it's not just him, it's also his father. His father was a former governor of Pennsylvania, and he had the same name as he does, Bob Casey Jr. And so with decades of name recognition of winning statewide elections, you generally start to develop a level of trust with your voters. And so that's why in the polls for this election, for this state, Bob Casey Jr. has been ahead in every single one of them against David McCormick, who's not even a bad candidate. He's more of a moderate candidate, and he's also a businessman. But the thing is, Bob Casey Jr. and Tammy Baldwin just have such great name recognition. Now, in Michigan, the current Senator Debbie Stabenow is not running for re-election, and so you have an open seat here. But the thing is, Alyssa Slotkin is almost just as good as Tammy Baldwin, or will be just as good as Tammy Baldwin at being popular with voters, because she appeals to a wide range of voters based off of her experience working for blue-collar voters and as well as moderates. So in Michigan, what you need to win is, at this point, the moderate suburbs, the union voters in blue-collar areas of the state, and then your Democratic base, of course, in Detroit, in Ann Arbor, and as well as in Lansing, and then in this election cycle in particular, Arab Americans, because of what's going on in Gaza. And Alyssa Slotkin is able to thread the needle with all of these different groups of voters together, and that makes her a very strong candidate. She was able to do this in her competitive election campaigns in the 2018 and the 2020 as well as 2022 elections, and she'll be able to do it here in the Senate elections. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, the GOP has mostly been in shambles after 2020. The state party committee for Michigan has trended way more right-wing compared to what the state partisanship level is. And so the Republican Party hasn't been able to fundraise as much in the state in recent years, and that's costed them, costed isn't really a word, but that's cost them a lot of races, especially on the statewide level. In 2022, Gretchen Whitmer, the Democratic incumbent governor, won by double digits by a landslide against her opposition, Tudor Dixon, and that's because of the incompetency that the Republicans have been in since 2020, since adopting Trump's position. And that's the thing with these Rust Belt states, right? Trump is very popular because he is a businessman who can market well. And so he has this populist aura that many blue-collar voters are attached to. But this same kind of aura does not translate to down ballot races, because for many of these candidates, they don't have the same kind of background that Trump has. They're more of a government type candidate, and so they don't have the same kind of outsider or who's going to change the system, who truly represents the people like Trump does. And so that causes these races to be more democratic. Now, if we look at the Southwest, the same thing is mostly true here because of candidate recognition on both sides this time. If we look at Nevada, in the Nevada Senate election, you have incumbent Senator Jackie Rosen. She communicates incredibly well to her constituents, and so she's been very popular with her with the state. And if you compare that to Sam Brown, even though Sam Brown has a great background, he's not necessarily well known to most people. And so, with people like in the current senator, they might not have as much of an appetite as they normally would with an open race to consider an unknown candidate. And that's reflected in the polls. You can see here that Jackie Rosen has won in virtually every single one of these polls. And the same is true in the Arizona side of things. If you look at Arizona, it's actually flipped. Ruben Gallego isn't necessarily known that well, but the thing is, Carrie Lake is known well in Arizona, and not for good. She ran in 2022 for the governor's position, and she branded herself as this Trump kind of candidate, extremist Trump candidate, pro-Trump conservatism, and that cost her that election. And so, if you look at the polls, asking people how do they rate Carrie Lake as a person and as a candidate, it's generally been unfavorable for the whole state of Arizona. Not necessarily on the Republican Party sides, because Carrie Lake is able to galvanize Trump voters, but you can see here that among moderates, they tend to lean away from Carrie Lake, and that's what's been contributing to these favorable poll ratings for Ruben Gallego. So we think that Arizona and Nevada are going to lean Democratic. Now we end up with these two races. These two races are interesting because Trump has won these states by very large margins. If you look at Ohio, he won it by 8 percentage points, and pretty much the same in the 2016 election. If you look at the 2024 election, Trump is ahead of Kamala Harris by double digits. And so this is a state where Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat, is going to need to do a lot of ticket splitting. But that is possible. And the reason why that's possible is because, like Bob Casey Jr. of Pennsylvania, Sherrod Brown has made himself a name, and that name goes back decades. If you look at his history, he was previously the Secretary of State in 1982, first winning his first statewide election, and since then he's been a well-known advocate for labor and union causes. And so even though in the past decade many of these blue collar worker jobs have been lost to overseas manufacturing because of the strong advocacy that Sherrod Brown has made for himself, defending union and labor movements, they still trust him, even though the landscape has changed. And so Sherrod Brown is uniquely able, with his name recognition spanning decades, he's able to carry through even if Trump wins the state by 15 percentage points. Pair that with Bernie Moreno being more of a right-wing candidate, more of a Trump candidate, which, as I said earlier when I talked about Michigan, doesn't necessarily translate to votes. You'll see that Sherrod Brown is still ahead in every single one of these polls, even in a increasingly Republican state. The same can't be said for Montana, though. Montana is even more of a Trump state. 20.5 percentage points won here in 2016, 16.4 percentage points won here in 2020. And so if you also look at the Senate level, in past elections when Jon Tester, the incumbent Democrat, first ran, he won with less than a percentage point. And this was during a blue wave year, where states such as Nebraska were won by double digits for the Democrats. You don't see that today, and you don't normally see a Democratic statewide position in Montana. But you can see here in these elections, Jon Tester has been able to fight tooth and nail in every single one of these. He didn't even win in a majority in this election, but he was able to win because of the amount of Republican voters, or at least independent voters, who chose to vote for a Libertarian instead of a Republican candidate. And then if you look at 2018 here, he still won by very narrow margins, 3.6 percentage points. And so now he's going against Tim Sheehy, who might actually be the best of the so far, the best Republican to run against Jon Tester. And that's reflected in the polls. You can see here that Tim Sheehy in recent days has won more in these polls compared to Jon Tester. But, and here's the big but, Jon Tester, his story is pretty good for Montanans, which is that he's a rural farmer, and he was more on sort of the labor side of things before shifting to politics, shifting immediately to the position of senator. And so Jon Tester has, like Sherrod Brown, made a name for himself, although it doesn't necessarily go far back as Sherrod Brown or Bob Casey Jr., and that's why it's a lot more competitive this time around. But we think that he'll be able to eke it out. I mean, if you look at 2012, and if you look at rural state polling in general, it's much more inaccurate. There's a much greater margin of error than there typically is for a more urban state, or even a more like mixed state such as Michigan. And so you can see here that Denny Rayburg, who ran against Jon Tester in 2012, he was performing better than Jon Tester in these polls leading up to the election, but Jon Tester won. And so the same thing we think will happen here, because Jon Tester is a really good campaigner. He's able to activate voters that don't typically vote for elections, such as Native Americans. And so we would rate this as leans Jon Tester as of now. But it can change. A lot of things can change between now and November, especially because people don't really pay attention to these races until maybe a month before the election, let alone, I mean, yeah, they normally don't pay attention to presidential races. Like, they don't figure out how to make a decision until around September, let alone Senate races. So we still have a lot of ways to go, but as of now, Democrats win because we project, or not project, but we think that as of now, Kamala Harris will win the presidency, and so the VP, Tim Walz, would break this tie in favor of the Democrats. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.